When I was in seminary, when I was in school, becoming a priest, this gospel scene indirectly, it was indirectly right in front of my face every single day. Because the chapel, where we would all gather in the morning for morning prayer, for mass and everything, for we'd be there about an hour and a half or so. Every single morning, this gospel was in front of me indirectly, because on the wall above the altar were inscribed in Latin the two most famous phrases from this gospel: Noli te timere and Duc in altum. Noli te timere, do not be afraid. Duc in altum, put out into the deep. Very famous. And so again, every single morning, I had these very challenging, but also very encouraging, very important words that Jesus just speaks to each and every single one of us. Do not be afraid, but put out into the deep. And I think this scene and these readings that we have today, they're very providential for us today. Right? Today, as we begin this spring series that we're calling Renewing. Because in all the readings, what's going on is people have this powerful encounter with God that really truly transforms their life. Our first reading from Isaiah. Right? Isaiah has this very powerful vision from God. And there in that vision, his life is totally changed. Simon Peter, in the Gospel, Simon Peter has that very famous scene where Jesus just kind of hops in his boat, kind of rude, but then tells him to put out into deep water. Right? Simon Peter's life is forever changed from that day forward. But it speaks to, again, that seemingly abrupt and unexpected ways that God can just kind of show up in our life and things begin to change. And it's an amazing thing, right? How God can just one day just kind of show up and things begin to change. But here's the thing, and it's a big but. But Jesus, God, he never then forces himself on us. He'll show up unexpectedly, and it can be kind of annoying at times. Like, what the, right now? Come on, Jesus. But he'll never then force himself on us. He'll always ask for our cooperation. He'll always ask for a free response from us. Every single time. And that's then going to be the most important decision in our lives. When Jesus shows up in our life, again, unexpectedly at times, and then asks for us to respond, what will I do? What will you do? Will we respond to that? Will we cooperate with what God is doing? Because Jesus then, very typically of Jesus, he's always going to ask us, Duc in altum. He's going to ask us to put out into the deep. And sure, literally in this scene, it means that Jesus told Peter, let's take the boat that way. Sure, but spiritually, what Jesus is asking is he's saying, hey, Simon Peter, let's go a little bit deeper with your faith. Let's get out of the shallow water where it's easy, and you can just step out of the boat and into the ground, onto the floor of the sea, and you can still swim. It's still fine. You can still walk on it's fine. But he's like, no, let's go out into the deep where things are out of control, and it is a little bit more dangerous. And that's what Jesus is asking. And Simon Peter and Isaiah too, whenever God makes this request and God's like, hey, let's go a little bit deeper, they have a very typical response. They start going, oh, I don't know about that. Let's tone it back here, Jesus. I don't know if we're doing that today. They also have an awareness of their sinfulness. They're like, Jesus, do you know me? Come on, I don't know if that's for me. But then they also just feel this sense of being overwhelmed. They're just like, that's just a lot you're asking. Into the depths, into the deep, like, ugh. It seems like a whole bunch, Jared. I don't know about that. Okay. So I think then, and this is why I think it's so important and so providential that we have this today as we begin. It's very easy for us to have that same sort of experience as Isaiah and as Simon Peter. It's a very similar experience. Like Isaiah, like Simon Peter, they believed in God. We believe in God. They did the church thing. We all do the church thing. Anybody here not believe in God? Anybody here like, we all get that. We all pray sometimes, pray before we eat, things like that. We're all on board. Okay, great. But then Jesus shows up, this series, anything shows up, and it's like, hey, let's go deeper into our faith. And we immediately, again, very typically start to think, I don't know about that. I'm just going to go to Mass and pray before I eat, Father. Let's just leave it at that. Let's just keep things nice and calm and easy. Let's just not rock the boat, pun intended. Like, let's just keep this chill. Again, it seems a little bit scary, and there can be a little bit of a doubt, like, I don't know if you know, so again, the very other important thing to know about this scene is, where are all the fish in the sea, on the Sea of Galilee? They're near the shoreline. That's why they fish near the shore. That's where all the fish are. So when Jesus says, let's go out into the deep, not only is Peter like, there's nothing there, but so Peter has this doubt. He's just like, really? To the depths? Come on, Jesus, I know what I'm doing. I don't think there's anything out there for me. Because that's that same doubt that we have. We're just like, sure, Father, I'm going to get deeper into my faith, but I just don't know if there's anything there. Maybe we've tried before, and we're just like, I don't know, let's just do it. Or, like I said a couple weeks ago, we've seen people that are super into their faith. Maybe they've been going to Mass for their whole life. Maybe that you see them praying all the time, but then you also see them around town, and you're just like, they go to church all the time, and they're a huge jerk. They're greedy, and they're this or they're that. And you're just like, so if that's getting into Jesus, I don't know if that's going to do anything for me. There's nothing really transformative about that. Let's just calm down, Father. Things like this come along, and I'm like, hey, we're going to spend a whole series talking about healing, and you go, yeah, okay, Father, great. Hope there's a couple funny stories along the way, but we're just going to let you do your thing. I'll come to Mass because I have to go to Mass, but then we're just going to kind of leave it at that. Maybe somebody else will have some powerful experience. Great for them. I doubt anything's going to happen for me, but we'll just sit through this. Thanks, Father. Okay, so again, there's this immediate kind of pushback when the invitation comes. Let's go more into the depths. Let's go a little bit deeper. So first and foremost, the first thing I have to say is when I talk about, we're going to spend these 10 weeks leading up to Easter talking about healing in the church's tradition. What I don't mean is, in a couple of Sundays, I'm going to pull out the snakes and we're going to start dancing around and be like, here we go, everybody. Who has cancer? Come up here. I will cure you. That's not what we're talking about. Although God still does physical healings, that's a real thing. Maybe we can talk about that one week. That's not really what we're talking about here. God physically does those miraculous healings for certain reasons, right? Okay. The healing we're talking about is that much deeper healing that God promises to each and every single one of us. It's that deeper healing of our heart. It's the healing of you as a person. Right? What makes you, you. God wants to work within your life and heal you where you need to be healed. That's a promise he makes. Okay, but then the second thing, when we hear healing, is then very easy for us to equate healing with being fixed. Like, if God's going to heal me, that means God's going to fix me. Like, for example, I have scoliosis, I have cancer. God needs to fix that. I have a bad job. I need a better job. God needs to fix that. I have something going on in my life. I need God to fix that. So many things. I have, things that happened in my past, 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. God needs to magically make those things go away. They never happened. Fix them. That's easily what we assume healing can mean, is God's just going to fix it. But that's not quite what it is. Simply put, to be healed in the sense that we're talking about, to experience God's healing that he promises to each and every single one of us, to be healed means to be set free, to love as we've been called and created to love, and to be loved as we've been created and called to be loved. To be healed means to be set free, to love and to be loved. Because think, what's the goal in our lives? What does God ask of us? What does God expect from us? If the goal in life is to be rich and famous and to be beautiful and to be at 6% body fat and to be shredded and to always be going on vacations and always be doing these things, if that's the goal of life, and that's what God wants for you, okay, prosperity gospel, if that's what God wants for you, then yes, he needs to fix you. He needs to get you a better job and he needs to get you all those things. And then God doesn't give us those things and we go like, guess God's not real. Well, it's like, that's not what God is promising us. That's not what God is asking us to do. Okay. What does God ask of us? What is his goal for us? What does he expect from us, each one and every one of us? What are the 2 great commandments? He expects us to love God above all things and to love our neighbor as ourselves. The call that God gives to each and every one of us, what we're created for, the goal is to love and to be loved. And so we should expect that God will follow through on his promise to free us from whatever prevents us from loving as we've been created and called to love, and prevents us from receiving love as we've been created and called to receive love. Does that make sense? So this is a very, very important distinction. Think of Jesus. Jesus is the very simple example of this, but also the perfect one. Where's Jesus' greatest act of love? Hint, I'm pointing at it. Okay. Jesus' greatest act of love also looks like his greatest moment of not being fixed. He's pinned to a cross. He's been beaten, scourged, abandoned by his friends, betrayed by his friends, condemned on false charges. The list goes on and on. Right? Jesus is definitely not fixed there. And yet in that moment, he is still able to love. And then when he rises from the dead, what does Jesus still have? It's kind of a gifts what I'm thinking question, but he still has his wounds. And he still has holes in his hands, holes in his feet. His side is still pierced. Even when he rises from the dead, he's still not fixed. But he shows us that even with our wounds and brokenness, whatever it is, we can still fulfill this vocation God has given to us to love and to be loved. I want to give you one simple example of this, which is also it's a messy example, which is why it's helpful. I finally found a story of a man from China, a different guy from China. This is a new guy from China. For those of you that are new, I have a very famous story of a man from China. I'm not telling it today. That's for a different day. There's a new guy from China I learned about. This guy's name is Mark Ji Tianjiang. Mark is also a saint of the church. So he's also a good example to hold up for us. Like the church holds up St. Mark as an example for us to follow. Mark grew up in a strong Catholic family in the 19th century in China. And by 35, he was a well-respected leader in his small town there, his community. He was a doctor, he was a physician, and so he helped and served the poor. He served the poor for free, right? He would take care of them for free. It's great. He was also a family man. He had 2 boys, and then he eventually had 6 grandchildren. What happened in his life, though, is when he was 35, he contracted a very, very bad stomach virus. And being a doctor, he decided to treat himself, classic. But he treated himself with a medicine that was very common at the time, but also we now know is a bit problematic. He treated himself and the pain he had with opium, which is essentially just a pure form of heroin. Right? And kind of predictably, Mark became addicted to this stuff. But he was a good Catholic, and so he's just like, he wasn't just like, oh, sweet drugs. No, he was just like, this isn't good. And so he begins to fight it. Again, a good Catholic boy, he starts to fight it. And one of the things that he does is he starts going to confession very, very regularly, confessing his sin, right? Confessing this of using drugs. Great. But after a couple of years, the priest gets kind of fed up with him. Right? The priest, like many people today, didn't really understand addiction, didn't really understand that at a certain point, I don't know if you knew this, if you're not free, you can't commit a sin. Did you know that? Like, if you need freedom in order for something to be a sin. Okay. Still bad to do drugs. But like at a certain point, addiction, it robs you of your freedom. And so it's no longer you're doing a sin. All of a sudden it becomes a disease, a disorder you struggle with. Right? Okay. So, but the priest didn't understand this. And the priest eventually gets fed up with Mark. And he goes, this dude isn't even sorry. He just comes here because he's coming here to try to get away with something. So he tells Mark, all right, Mark, you're done. No more confession for you until you kick the drugs. And also, since you can't go to confession, no more Eucharist for you. Can't receive the Eucharist anymore, man. So this devastated Mark, because Mark was going to daily mass at the time. And so he was just very devastated that all of a sudden he couldn't go to confession, couldn't receive the Eucharist. But Mark knew that even if he couldn't stay sober, he knew that God still wanted him to come to the Eucharist, come to Mass, to worship him. But then also God wanted him to continue to follow him, to be his disciple. He wanted him to continue to love. And so for the next 30 years of his life, he struggled with this, but he continued to show up to Mass, and he continued to serve and to love the poor there in his community. For 30 years, he would ask just for a blessing at Mass, but ask for the grace to persevere in love. So then, after that 30 years, he was about 65 at the time, in 1900. That's also when the Boxer Rebellion broke out in China. Right? The Boxer rebels, they were a very violent, very radical Chinese nationalist group, and they began hunting down to destroy every foreign influence that had crept into China, especially the European missionaries and the Chinese Catholics. Right? They were just hunting them down. One day they got to Mark's door, knocked on his door and arrested him, and also his 2 sons that were there, and one of their wives, and his 6 grandchildren, hauled them all off to prison. And imagine, again, Mark's there with his family, but also with a bunch of other people from the town. And they must have been thinking, because again, 30 years of using, he had really just kind of emaciated himself. He was very skinny, kind of like skeleton-like. So they all knew what was going on. But they must have looked at him and been like, this guy, first chance he gets to renounce his faith, he's given up on it. He's getting out to get back to his pipe. Look at this guy. And Mark was given the chance to renounce his faith and to set himself free. But in that moment, he said, heaven is open, we would rather die than give up our faith. And so they took him and his family off to be executed. And Mark, on the way, he begged them. And he begged them, let me be executed last. Because he wanted to be able to be with his family and not leave them alone as they were executed. And that's what happened. And when he finally faced his execution, he died praising God and singing a hymn to our Blessed Mother. Okay. Mark went to his death and as an opium addict, not was an addict, but as an addict. So he wasn't, this is one of the biggest points, Mark wasn't fixed. God never fixed him. He still had a lot of struggles and battles that he faced in his life. And yet, Mark truly did experience God's healing power in his life. Why? Because he could love as he was called and created to love. So don't hear what I'm not saying. My point is not, drugs are fine, everybody. Murder, totally fine too. Do whatever you want. Everyone's going to heaven. Let's go. That's not the point. Never said that. Never will. The point is that Mark, even though he struggled with this disease of addiction, he could still love. He still experienced a healing to the point that he could still love as God created him and called him to love, and to be loved as God had created him and called him to be loved. That's the point, right? Even in his brokenness, even in his weakness, that could still happen. Mark loved in the midst of the suffering and the struggle that he went through. And in that ultimate act of love, he even gave his life for his faith. And even today, he's then a source of great inspiration to people who struggle with addiction, patron saint of addicts. So look at this guy. There's 50 other examples I could give, don't have time for, but like think of St. Paul, our patron. St. Paul, our patron, prayed very famously, Lord, take this thorn out of my side, the thorn in my flesh. Paul struggled with something in his life. We're not totally sure what, but there was something he very much struggled with. And he asked God to fix it, to take it away. And what did God say to Paul? Nah. Why? Because my power is made perfect in your weakness. My grace will be sufficient for you. Paul wasn't fixed, but Paul did experience a great healing in his life because as the rest of Paul's life shows, he loved as God created him to love. He was loved as God created him to be loved. St. Peter from the gospel. St. Peter struggled with a lot of things in his life. He was never totally fixed. And yet, does anybody want to say that Peter didn't love? Okay, exactly. All right, so this is the point. Jesus, he can and does and wants to do the same thing for each one of us. Right? He wants that even in the midst of whatever we struggle with, he wants to heal us to the point that we can continue to love in the midst of that. Yes, that will mean setting aside sins and helping us to overcome sins. Great. But that doesn't mean that all of a sudden you're going to be cured of scoliosis. That doesn't mean that you're going to be healed, fixed of whatever other problems. In the midst of the sufferings that we all face, in the midst of the challenges that each one of us has in our lives, we can continue to love as God has created us and called to be loved. So, as we begin this, just go back to those two simple phrases from the gospel. Noli te timere, do not be afraid, and put out into the deep, duc in altum. In these coming weeks, right, don't be afraid to go to a greater depth in your faith, right, where God actually does want to do something powerful in your life, even though it may not look like what you hope it looks like or want it to look like. He can lead you to the point of fulfilling that vocation that he's given to each and every one of us. And then also, when we come to our Mass, pay attention to those words that we pray right before communion and pray them. Right? Lord, I'm not worthy that you should enter under my roof. Lord, I'm not perfect. I struggle with things. Lord, I'm not worthy, but only say the word, and my soul shall be healed. Only say the word, Lord, and I will be healed.